The cold December air clung to the ground at New York's Idlewild Airport, now JFK, where Air France Flight 11 prepared for its transatlantic journey to Paris. The Boeing 707, a marvel of modern aviation, gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the terminal. Passengers filed in, some weary from layovers, others excited for their European adventure. Among them were businessmen clutching briefcases, families bundled in thick winter coats, and a few celebrities who preferred the luxury of Air France's impeccable service. Captain Jean-Luc Moreau, a seasoned pilot with over 18,000 flight hours, adjusted his cap and glanced at his crew. His first officer, Michel Durand, gave him a confident nod. The flight engineer, Pierre Lafarge, checked the final fuel reports before signing off on the aircraft's readiness. Everything appeared normal. Yet, beneath the surface of routine procedures, fate was weaving a story that would defy logic. As the last of the passengers settled, the jet's doors sealed with a mechanical hiss. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstrations while the engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the fuselage. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the control tower cleared Air France 11 for takeoff. With a powerful surge, the aircraft raced down the runway, lifting off into the ink-black sky. No one knew they had just embarked on one of the most bizarre flights in aviation history. 30 minutes into the flight, the 707 leveled off at 35,000 feet, gliding effortlessly over the Atlantic. Inside, the passengers relaxed, some ordering champagne while others dozed in their reclining seats. The hum of the engines became a lullaby, masking the growing unease within the cockpit. "Captain, we're experiencing a slight fluctuation in our airspeed indicator," Durand reported, his brow furrowing. Moreau adjusted his headset and scanned the instruments. True to Durand's words, the needle wavered ever so slightly. It was nothing serious, yet. "Keep an eye on it," he replied, unwilling to sound the alarm just yet. Minutes passed. Then a sudden jolt rocked the aircraft. It wasn't turbulence, at least not the normal kind. It felt as if something had pulled at the plane. "Did you feel that?" Lafarge asked, his voice tinged with concern. Before anyone could answer, the cabin lights flickered. Passengers looked up from their meals, murmuring in confusion. The lights stabilized, but a faint rhythmic clicking sound echoed through the cockpit. "Electrical interference," Durand guessed. Moreau frowned. He had flown through countless storms, dealt with equipment malfunctions, even emergency landings. But this was different. There was no storm, no warning, and the clicking. It wasn't from the instruments. It sounded external. He pressed the intercom. "Cabin crew, report any irregularities." A pause, then a shaky voice answered, "Captain, we just lost power to the galley. The coffee machines shorted out and there's an odd static coming from the PA system." Moreau exchanged a look with Durand. "Static?" "Yes, sir. Almost like whispers." A chill ran down Moreau's spine. This was no ordinary flight. The aircraft shuddered again, this time more violently. Alarms blared as the altimeter fluctuated erratically. The passengers, once relaxed, now gripped their armrests, eyes darting around in fear. Then came the voices. At first, it was a faint whispering, like a radio signal bleeding through an old receiver. But soon it grew louder, overlapping languages, some recognizable, others alien. The air felt thick, heavy with something indescribable. And then the impossible happened. Through the cockpit window, Moreau saw the stars shift, not in a way that suggested the plane was banking, but rather as if the entire fabric of the sky had moved. A strange aurora-like glow formed in the distance, pulsing erratically. "We're not alone," Lafarge whispered. The moment the words left his lips, the glow intensified. The plane's instruments spun wildly, the compass unable to find true north. Time itself seemed to stutter. A passenger's wristwatch observed through the security cameras was rewinding and jumping forward sporadically. Then came the shadow. A massive, amorphous shape loomed in the distance, darker than the void of space itself. It wasn't a cloud. It wasn't a storm. It was something else, something watching. Moreau, gripping the yoke with white-knuckled force, tried to maintain control. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Air France 11. We are experiencing—" Static swallowed his voice. The radios were dead. The world outside the plane flickered like an old film reel on the verge of tearing apart. Then, as suddenly as it started, the glow collapsed in on itself. The turbulence ceased. The whispering faded. The shadow disappeared. The instruments stabilized. The altimeter read 35,000 feet. The airspeed returned to normal. Had it been real? Or had Air France 11 just crossed through something it was never meant to see? Moreau exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. The crew checked their watches. Something wasn't right. According to their instruments, they had been in the air for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Yet, when Moreau glanced at his wristwatch, it still read 8:47 p.m., barely 30 minutes after takeoff. The passengers sensed the unease, but no one could explain what had happened. The crew, though trained for nearly every conceivable emergency, had no checklist for this. As they neared Europe, air traffic control finally responded. The operator's voice was fraught with confusion. "Air France 11, please confirm your position." Moreau complied, giving their estimated coordinates. Silence. Then, "Captain, that's impossible." "Explain." "You're ahead of schedule by 3 hours." The entire cockpit fell silent. No aircraft, not even the Concorde, could have achieved such speed. Yet, when the flight landed in Paris, the clocks confirmed it. Air France 11 had arrived impossibly early, its fuel reserves untouched, as if they had barely burned any fuel at all. Passengers looked disoriented, some rubbing their temples as if recalling a dream they couldn't quite remember. Baggage handlers and ground crew exchanged puzzled glances. How could a flight that had taken off at 8:15 p.m. land at what should have been an impossible time? Air France conducted an internal investigation. No anomalies were found in the black box recordings. Only static during the moment of the incident. Over the years, rumors circulated among aviation circles. Had Air France 11 slipped through time, encountered a rift in the sky, or something even stranger? Official reports dismissed it as a navigational miscalculation, but those who were on board knew better. And the whispers, some say they never truly stopped. Because every now and then, in the dead of night, a transmission echoes on old frequencies. A single, ghostly message. "This is Air France 11, requesting clearance to land." The insane story of Air France 11. Continuation. The passengers of Air France 11 disembarked in Paris, their minds burdened with an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. Some felt as if they had arrived from a dream, while others could not shake the feeling that something had been erased from their memory. The whispers had stopped, the static had vanished, and yet an unsettling aura clung to the aircraft as if it had brought something back with it. Captain Moreau, still dazed from the events, walked alongside his crew as they exited Charles de Gaulle Airport. He clutched his flight log, the numbers staring back at him as a cruel paradox. A flight that had taken off at 8:15 p.m. and landed ahead of time, defying the very laws of aviation. He had flown countless flights, battled storms, and dealt with mechanical failures, but never had he encountered something that challenged reality itself. As he made his way to the airline's operations center, a uniformed man approached him. "Captain Moreau," the man said, his voice level but firm. "We need you to come with us." Moreau hesitated. "And you are?" "DGAC," the man said, flashing an identification card bearing the insignia of the French Civil Aviation Authority. "There are questions that need answering." A deep unease settled in Moreau's gut, but he nodded and followed. What had happened to Air France 11 was far from over. The room was dimly lit, lined with shelves containing case files thicker than Moreau's flight manual. A large screen on the far wall displayed a radar feed, showing the path of Air France, Heathrow 11 across the Atlantic. Moreau, along with his first officer Durand and flight engineer Lafarge, sat across from a panel of officials. Some were from Air France, others from the DGAC, and a few bore no insignia at all. An older man at the head of the table cleared his throat. "Captain Moreau, can you describe, in detail, what happened during your flight?" Moreau exhaled slowly. "We were at 35,000 feet when we experienced an unidentified atmospheric disturbance. The aircraft instruments fluctuated erratically, we lost radio contact, and then time itself seemed to stop. We saw—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "A phenomenon, a structure of light, pulsating, shifting the very stars around it. And then there was the shadow." A murmur passed through the panel. "What kind of shadow?" one of the officials asked. "A massive, amorphous shape," Moreau said. "Darker than the void. It was watching us." Silence hung heavy in the room. One of the men, who had yet to speak, finally leaned forward. "Captain, are you aware that your flight's radar signature was lost for exactly 23 minutes?" Moreau's blood ran cold. "Lost?" "Disappeared, as if the aircraft was never there." Durand swallowed hard. "So it wasn't just an illusion?" The man shook his head. "Far from it." Meanwhile, one of the passengers, a journalist named Mathieu Giraud, sat in his Paris apartment, sifting through his notes. He had taken meticulous records during the flight, jotting down every strange occurrence. But there was one thing he hadn't told anyone. During the turbulence, when the lights flickered, he had glanced across the aisle at a fellow passenger, a woman with striking green eyes. But in that moment, her face had shifted, her features distorting for a fraction of a second into something inhuman. Her mouth stretched too wide, her eyes turned entirely black, and for just an instant it was as if she wasn't there at all. And then, just as quickly, she was normal again, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. Giraud had dismissed it as a trick of the mind, but now, back on solid ground, he wasn't so sure. He opened his notebook, flipping to the sketch he had hastily drawn of her distorted face. Then, a chill shot up his spine. The ink had smudged, the lines bleeding into each other as if the image itself resisted being recorded. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He needed to find that woman. Back at Air France's operations center, an engineer named Elise Fournier was assigned to inspect the black box recordings from Flight 11. Officially, there had been nothing wrong with the aircraft, but she had always been skeptical of official statements. She plugged in the recording and let it play. For the first 20 minutes, everything was standard: radio communications, engine hum, and occasional chatter from the cockpit. Then, the static hit. A low, crackling interference replaced the voices. At first, it was incomprehensible, but as she filtered through the noise, something emerged. It was faint, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. A voice. "Nous sommes toujours là." Her breath caught in her throat. The words repeated, over and over. "We are still here." Then came something even more chilling. A distorted transmission, garbled yet familiar. "This is Air France 11, requesting clearance to land." Elise's heart pounded. But the timestamp on the recording read 3 hours after the plane had already landed in Paris. Captain Moreau was granted leave while the investigation continued, but he couldn't rest. He sat in his Parisian apartment, staring at the night sky. The stars had always been his guiding light, the celestial map that had kept him grounded. in the vastness of space. But now, he wasn't sure if he was looking at the same sky at all. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found a pale-faced Mathieu Giraud, notebook clutched tightly in his hand. "You need to hear this," the journalist said, stepping inside. As he listened to Giraud's story about the woman with shifting features, the static in the galley, and the eerie sensation that something had followed them back, Moreau felt a familiar chill creep up his spine. Then Giraud handed him the notebook. Moreau flipped to the sketch, and his blood ran cold. It was the Shadow, the same amorphous figure he had seen beyond the cockpit window, the same entity that had loomed over their aircraft. Something had returned with them, and it was still here.